Imagine for a second that you are standing at the absolute summit of the literary mountain.
Okay.
You aren't just an author. You are effectively a corporation. You are an industry unto yourself.
Right. You're a brand.
A huge, you have broken Kickstarter records. And I don't mean you just edged past the old record. I mean you obliterated it, raising over $40 million directly from your fans without a publisher in sight.
Which is just, I mean, that's insane. That number is still staggering.
It's unbelievable. You have your own convention that sells out in minutes. You've sold 50 million books worldwide. And then the final piece of the puzzle slots into place. The one thing every author dreams of. You sign a massive, unprecedented deal with the largest tech giant on the planet to put your life's work on screens in every living room in the world.
It sounds like the ultimate victory lap, doesn't it? That is the hero's journey complete. You have won the game.
Exactly. It sounds like the happy ending. It sounds like the moment everyone pops the champagne.
The credits roll.
But today, we are diving into a narrative that says, hold on, not so fast. Because for a very vocal segment of the fan base, and specifically for the source material we're analyzing today, this isn't a victory, it's a funeral.
That is a stark way to put it. A funeral for what exactly?
And the soul of the work.
Right.
We are talking, of course, about Brandon Sanderson, the titan of modern fantasy, the man behind the Cosmere.
Right.
And we are looking at a scathing, and I mean scathing, critique that claims his recent mega deal with Apple TV isn't a reward for his talent. It's a payout.
The payout.
A transaction where he's sold his values to get a seat at the Hollywood table.
Selling his soul. We hear that term thrown around in music or art a lot, you know, usually when an indie band signs to a major label. But today we are unpacking a much more specific and frankly much more aggressive argument than just he went mainstream.
Right. This isn't just, oh, the movie won't be as good as the book. We are looking at a transcript from a video by John Del Arroz. He's a sci-fi fantasy author himself, and let's just say he is not mincing words.
Not at all.
He frames himself as a cultural commentator, providing real fantasy news. And his take is that this deal is the final nail in the coffin of the Brandon Sanderson we used.
To understand the gravity of his argument, we really have to look at how he views the land. He sees himself, and by extension, the fantasy genre, as being in a literal battle.
The culture war.
Exactly. He describes his content as telling it like unfiltered. He believes there is a fog of war over the published tree. He is the guy with
Unfiltered is putting it lightly.
Yeah.
He refers to the changes in Sanderson's work as woke, nut job, modern audiences nonsense.
Right. And that tone is important because it sets the stakes for him. The core accusation here is fascinatingly complex.
It really is.
It posits that Sanderson, who comes from a devout Mormon background and built his career on being a clean alternative to gritty, smutty fantasy, has fundamentally abandoned his values.
The very foundation of his brand, you could say.
The very foundation. The source argues that he has capitulated to what he calls satanic culture and corporate authorities, specifically Apple TV, in a calculated quid pro quo.
A quid pro quo. So the argument is, you give us the ideological content we want, the specific social messaging, and in return, we give you the keys to the kingdom.
That is exactly the claim. That the recent shifts in his writing, specifically in his latest book, Wind and Truth, were the price of admission for Hollywood. It was an artistic evolution. It was a down.
Okay, we need to really unpack this because that is a massive accusation. We are going to break this down piece by piece. We need to look at the details of this Apple TV because apparently the structure of it is unique. We need to look at the evidence the source presents regarding Wind and Truth. And we need to look at the broader argument about culture, values, and what the source calls the total sellout.
And just a quick disclaimer before we go deep. Our mission here is to objectively analyze the arguments and claims made in this specific. We are unpacking the critic's worldview, his logic chains, and his evidence. We aren't here to validate whether he's right or debunk him, but to understand the narrative constructing.
Perfect. So let's start with the shiny object, the deal itself. What actually happened between Brandon Sanderson and Apple? Because usually authors sign an option, get a check for 50 grand, and never hear from Hollywood again. This sounds different.
It is vastly different. By all accounts in the source, this is a massive acquisition. Apple TV has secured the rights to the Cosmere universe.
A whole Cosmere.
Yeah. The source mentions specifically that Mistborn is being eyed for feature films, and the Stormlight Archive is slated for television development.
That is colossal.
Yeah.
Mistborn as a movie franchise, Stormlight as a high-budget show. That is the Game of Thrones treatment.
Actually, the source emphasizes that this wasn't just Apple walking up and handing over a check. It was a competitive situation.
A bidding war.
A bidding war. Sanderson apparently took meetings with most of the studio heads in Hollywood. Everyone wanted a piece of this.
Which makes sense. But walk me through that room. You're an author. Usually you are the one begging the studio to take a chance on your dragon book.
Right.
How does Sanderson flip the script? How does he get them to fight over him?
Leverage. Pure unadulterated. The source highlights this repeatedly. Sanderson didn't walk in with a manual. He walked in with an empire.
An empire. That's what I word for.
50 million books. But the real kicker, the thing that likely terrified and excited the executives, was the Kickstarter.
The $40 million one.
Exactly. He raised $42 million for 4 novels that he just decided to write in his spare time.
As you do.
As you do. And that proved to Hollywood that he doesn't need their marketing machine. He has a direct line to millions of wallets. That gives him power that almost no other author has.
So he sits down and says, I can do this without you.
I already am doing this without you. And that allows him to demand terms that are, as the source puts it, unprecedented. The source describes Sanderson having rarefied control over the screen translations.
Rarefied control. That sounds fancy,
Yeah.
but in Hollywood speak, what does that actually mean? Does he get to pick the catering?
Much more than that, much more. He is being positioned as the architect of the universe.
Like a Kevin Feige for the Cosmere.
Exactly that comparison. He has writing and producing roles, consulting roles, and crucially, approval rights.
Approval rights. That's the big one.
That's the one. The source explicitly notes that this level of involvement exceeds what J.K. Rowling has now, or even what George R.R. Martin had.
Wow. Okay, so he didn't just sell the rights and walk away to buy a yacht. He is in the driver's seat.
Theoretically, yes, and normally you'd think a critic like Arroz would be happy about that.
Right, the creator is in charge.
But the source immediately casts doubt on who is actually driving. While Sanderson has the title, the source flags a specific personnel choice that he finds deepening.
Oh, right, the producer. I remember this jumping out at me.
Yes. The source notes that Teresa Kang from Blue Marble is attached as a direct executive producer for the Stormlight Archive. Now, the source makes a very specific identity-based critique here. He states, and I'm quoting the transcript here, it's never a good sign when it's a woman executive producer.
He explicitly says that. He just puts it out.
He does. It's a very blunt assessment. It frames his skepticism about the direction of the adaptation right from the get-go.
So it's not about her resume or her past projects.
It's just that. He sees the personnel choices, specifically gender, as indicators of the ideological framework that will govern the show. In his worldview, the presence of certain demographics and leadership roles signals a specific kind of storytelling priority.
So on one hand, we have this narrative of Sanderson as the architect. He has unprecedented control. But the source is saying, look at who they're hiring. Look at who he's getting in bed with.
Exactly. He's arguing that the control is an illusion, or perhaps that Sanderson is willingly sharing control with people who have a different agenda.
Okay.
And that leads us to the buyer. Why did Apple buy this? What is their motivation?
Well, the obvious answer is they want money. Everyone wants the next Game of Thrones, right? Amazon has Rings of Power. HBO has Dragon. Apple needs a hit.
That is the industry standard answer. And the source acknowledges that Apple needs a flagship fantasy juggernaut. But he goes deeper.
Deeper than just they want a franchise.
Much deeper. He goes into the corporate identity of Apple itself. He argues that this isn't just about subscribing members, it's about content strategy.
And this is where the sellout hypothesis really starts to form. Because the source implies that Apple wouldn't just buy any fantasy series.
Correct. The source argues that Sanderson didn't need Apple to survive. He was thriving. He was his own ecosystem.
He had the $40 million proof of that.
Right, which leads the source to the darker conclusion. He didn't do this for survival. He did it for earthly riches and fame. And to get that, he had to agree to play by their...
Okay, let's unpack that phrase, earthly riches, because that feels very biblical.
It is intentional. The source uses highly religiously charged language throughout the critique. He refers to Satan and satanic culture controlling these corporations.
Yeah.
He views the major entertainment conglomerates not just as businesses, but as vectors for a specific moral corruption.
So when he says Sanderson took the ticket, he's basically describing a deal with the devil.
Yes. The ticket is the entry pass to the mainstream elite. But the source argues that the ticket has a price. You have to change your values. You have to change who you are to appease the authorities.
And he thinks this change was sudden.
No, and this is key. He argues Sanderson spent years publicly shifting his stance to prepare for this moment.
It's a long con.
In his eyes. A long, calculated grooming of his own image. And the source points to the timing as the smoking.
Timing of what?
Wind and Truth, the book with the controversial content, was released in December 2024. The Apple deal announcement followed right on it.
So in the source's eyes, Wind and Truth was the audition tape.
Or the proof of compliance. Look, I can write the kind of content you want. I can speak your language. Now give me the movie.
That is a very cynical take on the creative process.
It's the core of his entire argument that the art is no longer the point. The art is a means to a corporate end.
But why does he think Apple specifically demands this kind of content? I mean, there are tech companies selling phones and streaming. Why would Tim Cook care about the plot of a fantasy?
The source has a very specific profile of Apple TV's corporate identity. He argues that Apple TV is notorious for overrepresenting LGBT.
Does he give examples, or is this just a vibe?
He lists Foundation, The Murderbot Diaries, and Pluribus.
Okay.
He claims that almost every Apple TV Plus show features over-the-top LGBTQ moments that feel forced or disconnected. He sees a pattern of systemic inclusion that overrides.
And he traces this back to leadership, right? He mentions the CEO.
Explicitly. He points the finger directly at Apple CEO Tim Cook. The source notes that Cook is openly gay and argues that he has made diversity initiatives central to Apple's corporate identity.
So the logic chain is Tim Cook wants diversity, Apple TV mandates LGBTQ content, Sanderson wants Apple money, Sanderson writes LGBTQ content into Stormlight.
That is the exact causal link the source is drawing. He argues that diversity initiatives are prioritized at the expense of storytelling quality.
So when the Apple deal happened, the source's reaction was not surprise.
His reaction was, of course, this makes perfect sense. In his view, Sanderson signaled he was willing to provide the woke content Apple desires, and Apple rewarded him with the contract.
Okay, let's get into the evidence. Because the source keeps referencing this book, Wind and Truth, as the smoking gun. It came out in December 2024. If I'm a listener who hasn't read it, what exactly is in there that has this critic so fired up?
There are two main buckets of criticism regarding the ideological content, specifically regarding gender and sexuality, and the linguistic style. And for the source, these two are inextricable.
Let's start with the plot points. What happened?
The source zeroes in on a prominent gay romance between two characters, Renarin and Rollin.
Okay, refresh my memory. Renarin is the prince, right? Alinar's son.
Yes, Renarin Colin, high nobility, extremely powerful magic user, has a unique connection to the spiritual realm.
And Relin is a listener, one of the singers, often referred to as a Parshendi in the earlier books. He's a member of Bridge 4.
Correct. The last of the old listeners to join them. An outcast among his own people, and for a long time, an outcast among...
So we have a romance between a human prince and a listener.
Yes. And the source also mentions the inclusion of an openly transgender character. He describes these elements as jarring, forced, and cringe.
Forced is a word that comes up a lot in these kinds of critiques. But let's be real. Noble falls for commoner is the oldest trope in the book. Aladdin, Titanic. Why is this specific pairing forced to him?
Well, regarding the romance, the source calls it pandering on a... He argues that the pairing is nonsensical due to the power...
Because one's a prince.
He puts it as, one is the most powerful man on Roshar, referring to Renarin Stand, and the other is an outcast from Bridge 4, who is also a different...
So he thinks the gap is too wide to be believed.
He thinks it borders on nonsense, but his bigger critique is the lack of build. He claims Relaine is suddenly romantically interested in Renarin after several books of this not being a thing.
So he feels it came out of nowhere. Like a switch was flipped.
Yeah. He views it as a sudden injection of ideology rather than a natural character progression. He believes the characters were shoved together to check a box.
And if you're checking a box right before a Hollywood deal...
The source, that's suspicious. It's not storytelling. It's a resume item for your pitch to Apple.
Okay, so that's the romance. But he also talked about the language. And I have to say, this part stood out to me because he gets very specific about words.
The linguistic anachronism. This is a very common critique in fantasy circles when modern terms slip in. But Delars takes it a step further.
How so?
He argues that Sanderson is using modern language that completely breaks the medieval fantasy immersion.
Give us the examples. What words are we talking about?
The biggest offender, according to the source, is the word therapist.
Therapist. In a high fantasy world with magic swords and high storms.
Yes. The source claims that the character Kaladin is referred to as the world's first therapist.
Literally called that in the text. Like someone says, go see the therapist.
According to the source, yes. He cites a specific dialogue exchange involving Kaladin and Seth the Assassin in white.
Right.
Someone asks Kaladin, are you his friend, his god? And Kaladin replies, no, I'm his therapist.
Okay, I have to admit, hearing that out loud, I am his healer of the mind. It sounds like fantasy. I'm his therapist. Sounds like a sitcom in New York. It does have a different ring.
Exact. And that ring is what the source hates. He calls this cringy and says it sounds like a modern woke person's blue sky timeline.
Blue sky timeline.
Yeah.
He's referencing the social media app Bluesky.
He is. And for listeners who aren't on it, Bluesky is associated with a more progressive, left-leaning user base compared to X.
Right.
So by using that term, the source is saying the dialogue sounds like it was written by a specific type of very online progressive person. He's saying the characters don't sound like warriors on Roshar. They sound like HR representatives or social media.
What other words did he?
He mentions the word racist.
Racist.
A character apparently calls Kaladin racist due to his beliefs about the singers.
I see.
The source argues this is applying a very modern socio-political label to a fantasy. In a world of caste systems and species war, calling someone racist feels like importing 2024 American politics. And he also points out the repeated use of the word literally.
Literally? Like I literally can't even right now.
He says the word appears repeatedly in the text. To the source, this indicates that the characters are speaking like they are in a modern corporate environment rather than a fantasy setting.
It's interesting because he links the language to the ideology. It's not just bad writing to him, it's ideological writing.
Yes, that is the critical connection. He cites a review from another YouTube channel called Iron Seas, which did a 2-hour breakdown of the prose. The verdict is that the characters sound like modern, specifically modern, politically correct people cosplaying as fantasy characters.
And if the characters sound like they're in a corporate environment.
It fits his theory that the book was written for a corporate. Precise. It all circles back to the sellout. If you write characters that speak the language of HR departments and social media, you are making the content safe and appealing for Apple exec. You are sanitizing the fantasy to make it marketable to the blue sky crowd.
Now, this leads us to the deeper betrayal the source feels, because it's not just about bad dialogue. It's about a history. He talks about Sanderson's background a lot. And this is where the sellout accusation gets personal.
This is section 4 of our analysis, the evolution of value. To understand the anger, you have to understand the expectation. The source emphasizes that Sanderson was raised in a Mormon background. He was seen as a nice guy and a devout.
And for a certain segment of the audience, that Mormon background carried a specific promise, didn't it? It signaled a certain kind of content.
It did. It signaled a certain worldview, a certain value. And the source claims that back in 2009 and 2010, Sanderson previously refused to include gay content in his books based on his religious faith.
So the source remembers a time when Sanderson explicitly said, no, I won't do that.
Right. The source points to older blog posts or statements where Sanderson discussed his struggle to reconcile his faith with writing, and this creates the conflict. Because now, in 2024-2025, Sanderson is saying something very...
And this is the retcon.
The source accuses Sanderson of a retcon retroactive con.
What's the retcon?
Sanderson has apparently claimed recently that writing Runner-In as gay was always the plan, dating all the way back to Way of Kings Prime in 2002.
Oh, wow. So Sanderson is saying, I didn't change. This was the seed from the beginning.
And the source calls this a direct lie. He uses the phrase, SJWs always lie, SJW standing for social justice warrior.
Very loaded term.
Very. And he points to those earlier refusals in 2009 as proof. His logic, if you refused to do it in 2009 because of your faith, how could it have been your plan since 2002?
That is a pretty direct contradiction to navigate. It's a forensic investigation of the author's intent.
It is. The source interprets this as Sanderson rewriting his own history to fit the current political climate. He believes Sanderson is gaslighting the audience to pretend he was always progressive, when the source believes he was actually a conservative who caved to pressure.
There is a quote the source pulls up where Sanderson explains his approach to Renner. He says, I wrote Renner-In the way I did because I wanted to try seeing through his eyes. That sounds like a standard author thing to say, trying to empathize with different people.
It does to most, but the source interprets this very cynically. He dismisses it as weird dialogue and implies the author was fantasizing about gay stuff.
Wow, okay.
He rejects the idea of empathetic exploration and frames it as a strange obsession, not as a creative process.
And what about the ally comment? I saw that in the transcript.
The source notes Sanderson stating he considers himself an ally to the LGBT+ community. To the source, this is the final nail in the coffin. It confirms that the author has sighed.
It really feels like a sense of loss for the source, like they lost a champion.
That is a crucial insight. The source explicitly mentions that Sanderson was popular because he offered a clean alternative to the smut permeating the genre.
Right, this was his whole brand.
He references Game of Thrones as the turning point where fantasy became gritty and sexy. Sanderson was the safe harbor. You could give his book teenager or your religious aunt, and it would be epic but clean.
I remember that being a huge part of his appeal in the early days.
Exactly. The source even contrasts Sanderson with a book called Morning Glory Milking Farm, which he warns listeners not to.
I remember that note. I'm going to take his advice and not Google that. But I assume it's the opposite of...
A very safe assumption. But the point he's making is that the genre is filled with extreme content, and Sanderson stood against that. By including gay romance and modern themes, the source feels Sanderson has betrayed that clean brand.
So it's not just a disagreement over a plot point. It's a betrayal of a promise.
A promise that was perhaps unspoken but deeply felt by that part of his audience. He views Sanderson as the good guy, who has now been corrupted by fame, money, and social conditioning.
So if Sanderson is lost, if the Titan has fallen, where does the source suggest people go? Because he's not just complaining, he's pitching. Right.
He is. He absolutely is. This is the pivot to the alternative. John Del Arroz positions himself not just as a critic, but as the solution.
Real independent fantasy.
That's the brand. He calls himself a prolific sci-fi fantasy author who is blacklisted from mainstream publishing.
Blacklisted. That's usually a career killer. But for him, it sounds like a badge of honor.
In this narrative, absolutely. It proves he hasn't sold out.
Yeah.
If the mainstream rejects you, it means you're telling the truth they don't want to hear.
So he's the authentic alternative.
That's the framing.
Wow.
He claims to produce clean, good stuff that is readable for everyone.
And he has a very specific policy regarding the content we just discussed.
He does. He calls it a pledge. He guarantees his works contain, and I'm quoting the source here, no way you put in the gay.
That is certainly a clear marketing stance. It's blunt.
It is a distinct market position. He promises none of the woke elements found in Sanderson's new work. He is explicitly targeting the disappointed Sanderson fan who feels alienated by the app.
So he's saying, if you like the old Sanderson, come read me.
That's the pitch. 100%.
And what is the book he's selling?
It's called The Adventures of Baron von Monmouth.
Baron von Monmouth, what's the vibe?
It's described as an airship swashbuckling adventure with a fantasy setting. It's a 5-book series available on ebook, print, and audio. He frames it as wholesome.
Airships and swashbuckling.
Yeah.
It sounds fun, honestly. If you strip away the culture war context, it sounds like Jules Verne.
And that's the appeal he's going for. Classic adventure, no modern politics, no therapist, just escapism.
He has this slogan, or call to action, make shame great again. What on earth does he mean by that?
He's arguing for a return to social norms where certain behaviors or content were stigmatized.
Okay.
He believes that society has become too accepting of what he views as terrible lifestyles, and he encourages listeners to support independent authors who refuse to bow to industry pressure.
So buying his book is a political act.
He views buying his book as a moral act, a way to fight back against the grooming he claims is happening in Maine.
It's fascinating how he ties purchasing a book about airships to a massive cultural battle. Buying this book is a vote against Apple, against Tim Cook, against the sellout.
That is the core of the real independent fantasy. It's consumerism as act. Every dollar you spend on Baron von Monmouth is a dollar you deny the satanic culture of.
So let's try to pull this all together. We've got the Titan, Sanderson, making the biggest deal of his life. We've got the critic, Del Arroz, claiming this deal is the result of a long con to trade values for cash.
The narrative arc the source presents is very clear. A beloved author achieves massive success.
Right.
The industry represented by Apple demands ideological conformity. The author compromises his original values to gain access to that next level of fame. The content subsequently suffers, becoming woke, forced, and anachronistic.
And then the deal comes through.
And finally, the massive corporate deal is signed as the reward for that compliance.
It's a tragedy in his eyes, the corruption of the hero.
Yes, and the overarching theme here is the tension between selling out and staying true. For the critic, you cannot have both. You cannot be the biggest author in the world and maintain your moral purity.
It raises a huge question about the nature of adaptation. When you take a universe as vast and personal as the Cosmere, something that came out of one man's brain over 20 years, and you hand it to a corporation like Apple, does the storytelling inevitably shift?
The source is convinced that Apple's values must supersede the author's. He argues that once you take the money, take the order.
And he argues that because money is involved, hundreds of millions of dollars, the author will always fold.
But there's another side to that question. Do the audiences care?
Right.
The source says audiences know better but are clapping like
It's a harsh image. Clapping seals.
He believes the masses are being duped or perhaps just pacified by the promise of high-budget spectacle. He thinks the smart audience, his audience, sees through it.
It leaves us with a provocative thought to chew on. If the source is right, and this content shift was a requirement for the deal, does that mean we will never see a traditional or conservative blockbuster fantasy franchise again?
Yeah, is that even possible?
Is the era of the clean epic over simply because the people cutting the checks won't allow it?
Or, conversely, is the definition of clean and relatable simply evolving with the times? And the critics are the ones stuck in 2000. The source would say the former. Sanderson presumably would say the latter.
And the listener is left to decide which books to buy, the airships or the Stormlight.
Indeed. It's a battle for your bookshelf.
Well, that was a heavy one, right? We went from Hollywood boardrooms to the plains of Roshar to the culture wars of YouTube, a true deep dive.
A true deep dive indeed.
Thanks for unpacking it with me. And to you listening, whether you're Team Sanderson, Team Independent, or just here for the drama, thanks for listening.
Until next time.
See you then.